Lindsay Herrera, and today I'll be presenting on the landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education of 1954. So, this case was one of the most powerful legal turning points in American history. It directly challenged racial segregation in public education and played a central role in launching the modern civil rights movement. So, through this speech, I'll walk you through the background leading to the case, the legal strategy used, the Supreme Court's decision, the resistance that followed, and the broader impact the ruling had not just on education, but on civil rights in America. So, first, let's start with why this case mattered so much. So, Brown v. Board of Education didn't just change the law, it changed what the law stood for. It forced Americans to reckon with whether the Constitution really did guarantee equality among each other, and even though the fight for civil rights would continue long after 1954, this case was the beginning of the end for legalized racial segregation in public life. So, first, let's set the stage. So, to understand Brown, we have to go back to 1896 to the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. That Supreme Court ruling said it was legal for public facilities, including schools, to be separate but equal. So you could have like two separate schools with white kids and black kids, and it'd be fine that they're separate, but it's only okay because they're equal. But like, were they really equal? No, like obviously they weren't. It's still like racism is a huge thing. So, schools for black children had less funding, fewer supplies, underpaid teachers, and crumbling buildings. And on the contrary, white schools had more resources. They had newer supplies in general, newer textbooks, and better facilities. And the Plessy decision gave legal cover to systemic racism and was used for decades to justify segregation. So now we're going to talk about the role of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So fast forwarding to the early 20th century, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People developed a smart legal strategy to challenge segregation through the courts. They knew that they couldn't dismantle segregation all at once, so they started out small. They started out small by chipping away at the idea of separate but equal, especially in education. One key figure in this effort was Thurgood Marshall, and he led the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Legal Defense Fund. He would go on to argue the Brown case that eventually became the first. He eventually became the first Black Supreme Court justice. So we're going to talk about who started this case and like how did it begin. So the case began with a third grader named Linda Brown in Topeka, Kansas, and she had to walk over a mile to catch a bus to her segregated black school, even though there was a white school just blocks away. And that literally makes no sense. Like, why would she have to go to a different school just because she's black and have to walk a mile? Like, if there's a closer school, then obviously you're going to want to go to the closer school. So because of this, her father, Oliver Brown, tried to enroll her in her white school, but was denied. And he and other parents, with help from the National Association of colored peoples, the NAACP, they filed lawsuits challenging school segregation in several states. These cases were eventually combined into one, which is the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. So the legal argument in Brown focused on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which was added after the Civil War. It says that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The NAACP's team argued that segregated schools inherently violated this clause because they stigmatized black children and made them feel inferior regardless of whether the physical buildings were equal or not. So even though the treatment was completely different, like regardless of how the school looked and stuff like that, it was just not the same. Like it was very obvious that that the white kids had it better than the black. So now we're going to talk about the primary source evidence that we have, which is the doll test. And so one of the most powerful pieces of evidence came from psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark, and their famous doll test showed that young black children, even as early as age 5, often preferred white dolls and associated them with positive traits, while seeing black dolls as bad. And obviously, because of the examples that they were seeing about how black kids were treated and white kids were treated, they were gonna feel inferior to the white kids. Like if they're being treated so bad, they're gonna think that there's something wrong with their skin color because of all the racism, and obviously there isn't, but it's because of the examples that they're seeing. So these results were presented to the court to show that segregation harmed children's self-esteem and development. And this was primary source evidence, real data from the time that revealed how deep the damage of segregation went, even if the schools looked the same on paper. And when I was looking at this, I was also connecting it to nowadays how there's movies that are replacing white characters with black characters, and there's people getting mad about it, but honestly, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Because it's just showing representation, because it goes back to these times, obviously, too, to see that black kids just didn't feel as represented, like they were put down. And it's just showing that everything that happens, it all goes back to how people were treated back then. But anyways, on May 17th, 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren delivered the unanimous opinion of the court. The justices concluded that in the field of education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This was a stunning reversal of Plessy and a clear statement that segregation was unconstitutional in public schools. For the first time, the court recognized that separate was not just unequal, it was unjust. So now let's talk about the actual words from the court, which you can find on the U.S. reports of the National Archives that you provided. And so the words were, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. These few words carried the weight of over half a century of legal segregation, and they effectively overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. It's one of the most cited decisions in Supreme Court history and a very powerful example of how the Constitution can evolve through interpretation. So, a year later, in 19 in 1955, the court issued um, Brown 2, which was supposed to guide how school integration should happen. The court said desegregation should proceed with all deliberate speed, but this phrase was very vague and allowed many southern states to delay or resist integration. Some districts dragged their feet for years or even decades, and others found ways to get around the ruling entirely. So there was a lot of resistance, obviously, and across the South, massive resistance movement formed to fight integration. In Virginia, entire public school systems shut down rather than allow black students to attend. And in Prince Edward County, schools closed for 5 years. White parents created private academies that only accepted white students. These efforts were backed by state governments, local affairs, and sometimes even mobs. Integration became a dangerous and deeply political fight. One of the most famous examples of this resistance happened in 1957, just 3 years after the Brown ruling. In Little Rock, Kansas, 9 black students, known as the Little Rock Nine, attempted to integrate Central High School. They were met with angry mobs, racial slurs, and physical threats. The governor of Arkansas even called in the National Guard to block their entry. President Eisenhower had to send federal troops to escort the students into the school. This showed that while the courts could declare segregation illegal, enforcing that ruling often required federal power and courage from everyday people. The Library of Congress um, has powerful photos from this era. One shows Elizabeth Eckford, one of the Little Rock Nine, walking alone while surrounded by an angry white mob shouting at her. And there was another one that shows black and white students walking together under federal protection. These images are primary sources, which are they are historical evidence of how the decision played out in real life. They're painful, but they really do help us understand the reality behind legal language. So beyond schools, like this court case had a big domino effect. The Brown decision didn't just affect schools, it energized the civil rights movement. It showed that change was possible and gave activists a legal victory to build on. After Brown, we see events like Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, the Freedom Rides in 1961, and the 1963 March on Washington, and eventually the Civil Rights Act of 1954 and the Voting Rights Act of 1955. Brown helped inspire these actions by proving that segregation could be defeated one law at a time. And I also wanted to talk about the criticisms and limitations I have about Brown versus Board of Education. And it didn't immediately end segregation. It didn't erase the inequality in education. In fact, many schools remain segregated today, not by law, but by neighborhood and income level. And in 2023, over 60 years after Brown, many schools in the U.S. are still racially and economically divided. That's not because of court rulings, but because of housing discrimination, zoning policies, and unequal school funding. So Brown was a major step, but the journey is still ongoing. And Brown versus Board also changed how courts view equal protection. After Brown, the court started using what was called strict scrutiny, which when reviewing laws that involve racial classification. That means that the government must have a very compelling reason to treat people differently by race. This legal standard helped protect civil rights in other areas like voting, housing, and employment. So Brown didn't just change schools, it changed how the law interprets inequality. Um, and so what we can learn from the Brown versus Board of Education is that first, that the law matters, but the people who fight to change it matter even more. It took parents, lawyers, students, and activists to bring this case forward. Second, that inequality doesn't happen overnight. Even with the Supreme Court ruling, people had to fight to put change on the ground. And third, that we still have work to do. Education inequality today is not as visible as segregated water fountains, but it's still real and it's still unjust. So, in closing, Brown versus Board of Education was more than a court case, it was a normal challenge to America's conscience. It asked whether we truly believe that all people are created equal and whether we are willing to fight for that belief, even when it's uncomfortable. The students' families and lawyers who took that stand helped move the country forward, and their story deserves to be remembered, not just in our history books, but in the decisions we make today. Thank you.